It was a dark and stormy night in Los Angeles. The wind howled, the trees swayed violently, and thunder roared. In the midst of the storm, a young man named Martin, a 28-year-old scientist, walked toward the secret laboratory located in the heart of the city. Martin was a tall and slim man with brown hair and green eyes. He was a brilliant scientist, but also a skeptical and pragmatic man. He didn't believe in ghosts or any kind of supernatural phenomena. The laboratory building was very old, located in a remote area of the city, surrounded by tall and dark trees. Rumors said that the laboratory was haunted by the spirit of a scientist who had been murdered there years ago. Martin always ignored these rumors. He believed that people were afraid of what they didn't understand. He was determined to prove that the laboratory was not haunted. That night, Martin was tired and exhausted. He just wanted to get home and rest. He walked quickly down the street, trying to ignore the storm. As he approached the laboratory, he saw that a light was on. He was surprised because the laboratory was closed to the public. Martin decided to investigate. He entered the laboratory and found it completely empty. The equipment was turned off and the tables were empty. Martin began to walk through the corridors looking for someone. Suddenly, he heard a noise coming from one of the rooms. He went to the room and saw that the door was open. He looked inside and saw a shadowy figure. The figure was tall and slender, dressed in a white coat and a black hat. The figure had a pale face and bright red eyes. An eerie atmosphere filled the room, and the scientist could feel a dark presence around him. Trying to contain his fear, Martin stepped back, but something compelled him to stay, as if invisible forces kept him in the frightening room. Martin was afraid. He tried to leave the room, but the door was locked. The figure turned and looked at Martin. The figure, with its red eyes fixed on Martin, began to approach slowly. A dense atmosphere filled the room, and the scientist could sense a somber presence all around him. Trying to contain his fear, Martin stepped back, but something compelled him to stay, as if invisible forces kept him in the frightening room. Desperate, Martin tried again to open the door, but it remained stubbornly locked. The figure, now just a few steps away, extended its spectral hand toward him. A frigid sensation enveloped Martin, making him tremble involuntarily. That's when the visions began. Distorted and frightening images flashed before Martin's eyes, like glimpses of dark events that had occurred in that laboratory. Deformed faces and shadows appeared before his eyes, mingling with distant echoes of anguished screams. The laboratory, now immersed in an aura of horror, seemed to come alive. Broken equipment began to squeak as if resurrecting, and books on magic and occultism on the shelves seemed to whisper forbidden secrets. Martin found himself entangled in a web of paranormal events that defied his rational understanding. The figure, reaching its peak proximity, uttered an unintelligible murmur. Martin, overwhelmed by a sense of oppression, fell to his knees. The air became dense, almost palpable, as the environment vibrated with a sinister energy. Terrified, he closed his eyes tightly, hoping that when he opened them again, the terrifying vision would disappear. However, when he dared to look at the figure again, it was face to face with Martin. In that brief lapse, Martin concentrated his strength and focus on his right hand, the part of his body that he could move more freely. With extraordinary dexterity, he began to make precise and coordinated movements, employing subtle techniques of disarticulation and twisting. And in that moment, Martin managed to free himself. The figure, realizing the momentary failure of the invisible chains, began to agitate, disturbed by the suspicion that something was out of its control. Martin, however, was already halfway to the exit of the laboratory. The creaking of the worn floorboards under his steps was a subtle echo, but the figure, now alert, began to perceive the absence of its captive. Martin's heart pounded in his chest as he approached the door, his fingers clenched in a mixture of triumph and anxiety. The figure, angered by the imminent escape of its victim, began to utter incomprehensible words in an ancient language, intensifying the intensity of the ritual to regain control over the lost chains. Martin, upon reaching the door, hesitated for a moment. His gaze met the human skull adorning the nearby altar, and the tension in the atmosphere became palpable. The door creaked slightly as it opened. Martin fled through the dark corridor, each step echoing like an urgent whisper. The figure, now aware of the escape, let out a furious scream that reverberated through the laboratory walls. The chase began, with Martin running through the dark hallways and the figure, a sinister entity, pursuing him with supernatural determination. As Martin dodged through the corners of the laboratory, the figure cast spells in his direction, creating dark manifestations that obstructed his path. The scientist, propelled by adrenaline, skillfully evaded the supernatural onslaughts, his sharp mind devising strategies to overcome each obstacle. The pursuit, a macabre dance between freedom and condemnation, continued. Martin, guided by the instinct for survival, desperately sought an exit while the figure, enraged and determined, cast curses and shadows in his direction. The laboratory, now immersed in the duality between flickering light and growing darkness, witnessed the battle between a man and a supernatural entity, both enveloped in the terrifying atmosphere of the unknown. The exit materialized in front of Martin, a partially open door leading to the outside of the laboratory. The scientist rushed out, inhaling the night air voraciously, as if emerging from a nightmare. Martin ran down the street in the midst of the storm, trying to get away from the laboratory as fast as possible. He looked back, but he didn't see the figure. He breathed deeply, relieved to have escaped. He kept running until he reached home. He entered, locked the door, and collapsed on the couch. He was exhausted but also relieved to be alive. He thought about what had happened that night. He still couldn't believe that he had witnessed such strange and frightening things. Martin decided that he would never talk about what had happened that night. He knew that he would never be the same again, as he had seen the dark side of another world.